There is a people in North America who seemed for a long time to fit neatly into history. They lived in the southern Appalachians. They spoke an Iroquoian language. They endured invasion, removal, and fracture, yet remained unmistakably themselves. To textbooks, that looked clear enough. To popular imagination, even clearer. The Cherokee were simply the mountain people of the Southeast, or else a branch of some northern Iroquoian past that had drifted south and settled there long ago. But the moment genetics entered the story, that clean outline began to blur, because the genome did not deliver a simple confirmation. It did something far more unsettling. It exposed a mismatch between language, geography, ancestry, and memory. It suggested that the Cherokee cannot be understood as a single line moving cleanly across a map. The deeper scientists looked, the less this became a story about one origin and more about layers, about an older world beneath the official one. And to be clear from the beginning, this is not a story about proving or disproving Cherokee identity. Genetic ancestry is not the same thing as belonging, citizenship, or nationhood, but it is a powerful archive of human movement. And in this case, that archive seems to preserve a past far more complex than the one most people inherited. The conventional story felt stable because parts of it were true. When Europeans entered the Southeast, the Cherokee were already there, powerful and deeply rooted in the southern Appalachian world. Their homeland covered a vast mountain region spanning parts of what are now Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Cherokee history, including Cherokee historical memory, is inseparable from that landscape. The ridges, valleys, river systems, and town sites of the Appalachians were not a temporary stop. They were home. At the same time, scholars noticed something that would not sit quietly in the background. The Cherokee language belonged to the Iroquoian family, and that family was far more strongly represented in the Northeast and Great Lakes world than in the Southeast. So a theory emerged that seemed reasonable. Perhaps the Cherokee were descendants of an older Iroquoian population that had once been connected to northern relatives, or perhaps had moved south from a homeland farther north in deep time. It was elegant. It explained the language. It respected the geography, and for a while that was enough. Except history is often most dangerous when it becomes too neat, because even before DNA, there were signs that the map did not quite close. The Cherokee were the only southern Iroquoian-speaking people known historically isolated linguistically from the northern Iroquoian cluster. That alone raised a question. If they came south relatively late, why did their southern world look so deeply embedded in the older cultural landscape of the Appalachians? Why did their political and social life appear so rooted there? Why did the supposed migration leave such an incomplete trail? And if they had always been part of a much older southern history, then why was their language pointing elsewhere? That tension mattered. Language was saying one thing, geography was saying another. Then mitochondrial DNA entered the story. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is inherited through the maternal line. It does not tell the whole story of a people, but it can preserve signals that are easy to miss in broader historical narratives. When researchers began comparing maternal lineages among native populations in the eastern United States, one result stood out. Cherokee mtDNA patterns did not fall neatly into the expected mold. They appeared distinct from other southeastern populations in ways that complicated the easy story. This did not prove a recent migration from the north. It did not prove the opposite either. It did something more interesting. It introduced friction. The kind of friction that tells researchers the model may be too small. And once that happened, the older certainty began to weaken, because genetics does not read history the way a textbook does. It reads surviving biological traces of who mixed with whom, who stayed, who moved, who married in, who stayed apart, and which lineages expanded or contracted over centuries. It can reveal maternal continuity that written history forgot. It can reveal male-mediated exchange invisible in language. It can reveal that a people who look singular in the present were formed through multiple streams in the past. This is where the Cherokee story became more than a question of location. It became a question of formation. Researchers began looking not only at maternal DNA, but also at Y chromosome evidence, which traces paternal lines. And this is where the picture became even more difficult to reduce. because the maternal and paternal histories were not telling the same story in the same way. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. A major study of Eastern North American populations found that while Cherokee maternal lineages appeared unusual, paired with some neighboring southeastern groups, Cherokee Y chromosome patterns showed broad similarities with southeastern Muskogean-speaking populations. In other words, the paternal signal looked deeply tied to the southeast, while the maternal story retained a different structure. Why would that happen? One answer lies not in migration alone, but in social organization. Many Iroquoian-speaking societies were matrilocal, meaning men moved to live with women's communities after marriage. In systems like that, maternal lineages can remain more locally structured and more distinctive across time, while paternal lineages may travel and mix more widely. Suddenly, what looked like inconsistency started to look like social history written into the genome. The story did not collapse, it widened. What seemed like a single ancestral question was becoming a layered one. Not just where did they come from, but how did different lineages move through Cherokee history? Which streams were older, which were local, which were shared with neighbors, which were preserved because of culture itself? And once that door opened, several explanatory frameworks came into view. The first was the older classic. The Cherokee as descendants of a northern Iroquoian-related population that moved south in deep prehistory. This theory had intuitive force because the language family pointed northward. If languages preserve ancient kinships, then perhaps the Cherokee were the southern remnant of a once more connected Iroquoian world. In this framework, the distinct maternal patterns could reflect long isolation after separation. The mountains became a refuge. Time did the rest. The second framework reversed the direction. Instead of imagining the Cherokee as northerners who came south, some researchers suggested that the ancestral Iroquoian population may have been rooted farther south, in or near the Appalachian region, and that northern Iroquoian branches later moved northeast. In that interpretation, the Cherokee are not an outlier stranded in the southeast. They are survivors of an older southern center of Iroquoian history that later split, sending related branches north while Cherokee ancestors remained tied to the southern highlands. That possibility changed everything, because if that reading is correct, then the usual map had been drawn backward. The third framework was less dramatic, but in many ways more realistic. It proposed that no single migration story could fully explain the Cherokee at all. Instead, their formation may have involved deep regional continuity in the southern Appalachians, long-term interaction with surrounding southeastern peoples, and an older Iroquoian linguistic inheritance that survived even as genes, marriages, alliances, and communities reshaped the population over time. Not replacement, not purity, formation, a people emerging from centuries of contact, distinction, and continuity. If stories like this interest you, subscribe, because the human past is almost never as tidy as the maps we inherit. Then came one of the most important turns in the evidence. A landmark genetic study comparing paternal and maternal histories across native populations of Eastern North America argued that the ancestral Iroquoian population may have lived in the southeast, with a later northern Iroquoian migration to the northeast. That mattered because it challenged a long-standing directional assumption. The Cherokee Y chromosome signal did not resemble a late-arriving foreign intrusion into the southeast. It looked deeply entangled with southeastern populations that had been in the region for thousands of years. That does not settle the case beyond doubt. The researchers themselves were cautious. They noted limitations in the data and emphasized that firm conclusions would require broader comparison, especially with northern Iroquoian paternal lineages, but the significance remained. The study did not merely add a detail. It changed the center of gravity. The old theory had assumed that the language problem needed a northern answer. The genetic evidence suggested the answer might be older, southern, and more regionally entangled than that. And then, just when the story seemed ready to resolve, it opened again, because later linguistic modeling pushed in a different direction. One influential analysis of Iroquoian languages estimated Proto-Iroquoian deep in the past and suggested that the most likely homeland of the language family may have been in the Finger Lakes region of what is now New York. So now the tension returned in a more refined form. Linguistic reconstruction leaned north, some genetic interpretations leaned south. Archaeological arguments pointed to Appalachian depth. None erased the others. This is the twist most people do not expect. The surprise was not that the Cherokee matched some exotic population they were never supposed to match. The surprise was that every simple story failed, not purely northern migrants, not a people whose entire past can be explained by one uninterrupted southern line, not a neat linguistic transplant, not a single genetic block. What the evidence reveals instead is something more difficult and more human. The Cherokee seem to emerge from a deep historical process in which language, place, social structure, and ancestry do not all move together. That matters far beyond one nation, because modern people are often taught to imagine origins as clean events. A group appears, it belongs to one category, it comes from one place. Its identity is then projected backward as if it had always existed in finished form. But that is rarely how human populations actually form. People move without replacing everyone. Languages spread without erasing all prior ancestry. Communities absorb outsiders without losing themselves. Maternal and paternal histories diverge. Catastrophe reshapes the genetic record. Survival itself becomes a filter. And in indigenous North America, that complexity is intensified by colonial violence. By the time modern science began testing DNA, the Cherokee had already endured epidemics, warfare, dispossession, internal political fracture, voluntary westward migration by some communities, and then forced removal on the Trail of Tears. Thousands died. Families were broken apart. Later, admixture further complicated the biological record. So, when someone asks what Cherokee DNA really is, the question is already too crude. There is no untouched archive floating above history. The archive has passed through fire, which makes what survives inside it even more extraordinary. Because what survives is not simplicity, it is depth. There is also a philosophical mistake hidden inside the public fascination with DNA. People often imagine that genes deliver a final verdict, as if the genome were a judge. But in population history, DNA is less like a verdict than a buried landscape. It contains traces, routes, echoes, bottlenecks, divergences, isolations, unions. It tells us that a people may be ancient in one sense, mixed in another, continuous in one region, and connected to distant relatives is in another. It tells us that identity is lived socially while ancestry is recorded probabilistically. The Cherokee story sits right inside that tension. Their language keeps them tied to the Iroquoian world. Their homeland places them in the southern Appalachians beyond dispute. Their genetic signals, at least in key studies, complicate the idea that they were merely latecomers from the north. Their maternal-paternal lineages do not resolve into a single narrative track, and the broader lesson is almost unsettling in its elegance. The genome may preserve what history simplified. Imagine the mountains now, not as scenery but as archive. Morning fog folding through the Blue Ridge, river valleys holding old paths long after the feet are gone. Chestnut ridges once alive with movement, smoke, ceremony, speech, trade, marriage, grief. Towns rising and disappearing, children inheriting a language older than the borders around them, men arriving from other communities, women anchoring lineages through place, seasons repeating while empires still far away did not yet know these mountains would one day be mapped, fenced, renamed, and emptied by force. Stand there long enough and the idea of a simple origin begins to feel almost absurd. No people formed in a landscape like that would be simple. And maybe that is the real revelation here. Not that the Cherokee were never Cherokee. That would be a shallow and damaging misunderstanding. It is that they were never the simplified version outsiders imagined. Never just a category in an ethnographic chart. Never just an isolated mountain tribe. Never just a southern branch explained entirely by a northern language family. Never just one stream. The deeper science goes, the more the Cherokee appear as a nation shaped by continuity and divergence at once, by ancient southern rootedness, by older Iroquoian connections, by social structures that preserve some lines while widening others, and by centuries of historical upheaval that made the surviving record both fractured and profound. In that sense, DNA did not strip away mystery. It restored it. It forced scholars to admit that the official story may have been too narrow, not because it was wholly false, but because it mistook one layer for the whole. The accepted narrative saw the Cherokee as if history moved in straight lines. The evidence suggests something older and more intricate, a people formed in the overlap between language and landscape, kinship and migration, endurance and change, and that is why this matters. Because once you see the Cherokee story clearly, you begin to see human history differently. The world was not built by pure populations sitting still in sealed containers. It was built by movement, adaptation, alliance, separation, return, memory, and survival. The boundaries we inherit are often younger than the people they try to contain. Scientists remain cautious, and they should. The data set is not final. The arguments are still alive. More work will refine what we think we know. But even now, one thing feels increasingly hard to deny. The old map was too small. The Cherokee were never who we thought in the simplistic sense. They were more ancient than a recent migration myth can hold, more layered than a one origin story can explain, more rooted than a language label alone can define, and perhaps more instructive than almost any other case in North America, because they show how identity can remain powerful even when ancestry becomes more complex, not less. That may be the deepest lesson the genome offers. Complexity does not diminish a people. It reveals the scale of what they survived. And if you want more science-driven histories where the evidence rewrites the map, let me know in the comments which population I should cover next. Because beneath every official origin story, there may be another one waiting, not erased, just buried deep enough that only now, in fragments of language, traces of lineage, and the quiet persistence of memory, are we beginning to see its outline again.